Okay, here's the next one, grade 7s. How did the conflicting points of view between the Métis and the Canadian government affect the identity of the Métis and the future of Rupert's Land? This is all that we're going to be taking a look at today in lesson 8.4. So stick around and let's learn something. 8.4 is the lesson. How did the conflicting points of view between the Métis and the government, this will be the government of Canada, affect the identity of the Métis and the future of Rupert's Land? We're going to learn today about the Red River Resistance that took place in 1869. It is important to understand that the Métis, they felt that Rupert's Land, you can see it here on the map, Rupert's Land belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company. The Métis believed that it belonged to the Métis, not the Hudson's Bay Company. And they had a good reason to believe that. They were living there for over 100 years. So they felt that it was their land. They worked the land, they trapped animals, they hunted. They were pretty much involved in the land. And at first, the Canadian government, they could have cared less. They didn't care much about Rupert's Land, so that's why they sold it to the Hudson's Bay Company. They saw no value in Rupert's Land. But eventually, they start to send Europeans west. Wow, what do you think is going to happen? If there's already people in this part of North America, British North America, obviously we know that there is going to be some sort of conflict. And that conflict happens because now Canada is starting to pay attention to what's happening in the West. For the longest time, nobody cared for Rupert's Land, like I just said previously. It was seen as a barren wasteland with poor soil. In the 1800s, farming was essential, and if your soil is poor, you can't farm, so therefore, things are going to be seen in a poor light. But in 1857, the government of Canada, well, not Canada yet, but the government sends a science team west. And the purpose of this team heading out west was to learn about the climate and see what kind of resources we have available to us in Rupert's Land. Scientists go out, they come back with a report. Turns out Rupert's Land is actually pretty good. It's sustainable, which means there are resources and the soil is good. So in that same year, this is good news for the government, because in that same year, the farmland that existed in Ontario was actually pretty scarce, and all of the good farmland was taken. So Ontario farmers start heading out west because they see that Rupert's Land has some good land that could be available to them. So we've got some different points of view there. Okay, so the views of Rupert's Land are going to be different. Okay, and its use was seen different, and this caused people to take different sides. So Poundmaker in 1874 says, "This is our land. It isn't a piece of pemmican to be cut off and given in little pieces to us. It is ours, and we will take what we want." So he's already there. He's a respected Cree leader. He's in Rupert's Land, and this is at a time when Rupert's Land is about to be sold to Canada. And his voice represents that of many First Nations people that are living in Rupert's Land at the time. Sir John A. Macdonald, who eventually becomes Canada's first prime minister, he says, "I am perfectly willing to leave Rupert's Land a wilderness for the next half century, but I fear that if the Canadians do not go in, the Yankees, that's the United States, the Yankees will, and with that fear, I would gladly see a crown colony established there." So John A. Macdonald is fearful of the American Manifest destiny actually playing out. And that American Manifest destiny we heard in previous chapters, that was the Americans wanting all of North America. So John A. Macdonald, he had reason to believe that if the Canadians didn't go out there, then the Americans would. And George Brown, he is he owns the national newspaper at the time called The Globe, and he's a politician, and he eventually works to be, and he's involved in the creation of Canada with Sir John A. Macdonald. Let the merchants of Toronto consider that if their city is ever to be made really great, if it is ever to rise above the rank of a fifth-rate American town, it must be by the development of the great British territory lying to the north and west. So he's fighting for Toronto to secure its foothold and to eventually become a first-rate city. But it's only going to become a first-rate city if they can secure Rupert's Land. And guess what? They do. It's in the 1860s where this is all starting to play out. What ends up happening is there's a steamboat service. So you can see here, this is a picture of a steamboat. This is going between the Red River Colony and Minnesota. Minnesota is a state in the United States. So the Red River Colony, through this regular steamboat service, is trading with the United States. Well, some flags are going to be raised. If we're trading with the United States, nobody seems to really own, I'm using air quotations, you can't see it, nobody seems to be owning this land. Well, what's going to stop the United States from taking over this land? So in 1869, a few years after Canada becomes a country, they purchase Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company for a measly, yes, I'm saying it, $1.5 million. If you convert that to today's currency, with inflation, all that kind of stuff, that's only $30 million. Can you believe that? All that land they got for $30 million. So they're laughing, right? Well, the Canadian government is laughing because they got a huge deal out of this. This leads the Metis to be kind of worried. The First Nations and the Metis that are living there, obviously, and rightfully so, they believe that the land belonged to them. They were there for over 100 years, and from their perspective, you can't buy and sell land. It's just not something you can do. You use the land. It's there for everybody to lose. So they were also worried about assimilation. What's going to happen to the culture of the First Nations and the Métis if now suddenly all of these Canadians make their way west? Is the Métis culture, is the First Nation culture going to be absorbed and then lost through assimilation? And then other questions, obviously, were still hanging around over there. Would there be a role for Métis and First Nations in government? So we've got Canadians coming over. They bought this land. Eventually, like, something is proper is going to be made, something legal is going to be made, something in terms of government is going to be made. So are the Métis and First Nations going to be a part of that government? Would they have a say? Would the Métis be able to keep their French language? And they were Catholics after all, so are they going to get to keep the Catholic religion? Those people from Ontario that were coming over, they were Protestant, so what's going to happen? What about the farms that the Métis already had? If the government of Canada now purchased this land, and the Métis don't, in air quotations, legally own this land, but are farming this land, what is going to become of those farms? And obviously, this goes in with assimilation. What are the English Protestants going to end up doing? Are they going to overwhelm the First Nations and the Métis that live there? So this brings us to the resistance of Red River. And this happens in 1869, December of 1869. Is when Rupert's Land moves over to Canadian possession. So it's legally part of Canada now. So, so the surveyors are sent by the Canadian government to prepare the land for colonists. And the surveying system that goes out there is different from that of the Métis farms. The Métis developed their farms based on the seigneurial system that the Canadiens had in Quebec. So these long strips of land, everybody has access to the river. The surveyors, they go out and they square off the land instead, so that not all of the pieces of land have access to that river. And as the surveyors are going out there, they're going on to Métis farms and all that kind of stuff. Nobody told the locals that these surveyors were coming out. So obviously you see somebody, a stranger that's on your land, you're going to confront them and say, hey, like, what's going on here? What are you doing here? Get out of here. So a confrontation takes place. So the surveyors, they're coming from the Canadian government. They're English. The Métis are French. They know French and they know other First Nation languages. They don't necessarily know English. So we're going to have some sort of, we're going to be lost in translation here. So somebody by the name of Louis Riel. You have heard of Louis Riel before. I'm sure you have. He is called over. He speaks English. He speaks French. He speaks some of the different First Nation languages that exist there. And he demands these surveyors to leave. He's like, this is none of your business being here. This is our land. You must leave. Well, he knew that this wasn't going to actually work, but he knew that this was going to buy him and his people, the Métis, some time. And that time is going to be used to prepare. They knew what was coming. Métis, led by Louis Riel, sees the Canadian government as a foreign government because the Métis had their own government. And the Métis believed that the land was in Métis territory. And this foreign government, the Canadians, they were encroaching and they were invading the Métis land. And you can't do that. Like, that's just not allowed. So that's how they saw the Canadian government, as a foreign government. And Louis Riel, he was, some background information, he was a Catholic. He actually studied to be a priest in Montreal. But nonetheless, he comes back to Red River and he starts this charge, this Red River resistance. And in that same month when Rupert's land switches hands to Canada, the Métis take control of Fort Garry and they establish a provisional, I should say, government. And Louis Riel is chosen as president. And they have a Bill of Rights that they create. Basically, they were okay with joining Canada. They were going to join Canada, but they wanted to negotiate the terms in which they join Canada. So the Métis provisional government draws up a Bill of Rights to present to the Canadian government. And here's some of the things that are mentioned on this Bill of Rights. I got the image here on the right-hand side. Either French or English would be used in the legislature. Government documents would be printed in both languages. So it doesn't matter what language you speak, French or English, both are going to be recognized in the legislature. This is one of the Bill of Rights that they wanted. Laws for the new province would be decided by the residents that are living there, not by Ottawa. The Métis would keep the rights to their land and the seigneurial system for farming. Your local officials, so your sheriffs, your magistrates, so those are your judges, school commissioners, and so on and so forth, they would be elected by the local people because the local people know what's best for the area that they are living in. And the federal government would negotiate treaties with the First Nations that are living there in order to benefit everybody. So this is what the Métis are doing. They are dictating their terms of entering into confederation and joining with Canada, which will then obviously lead to the French and the English taking sides. The Métis, they didn't have 100% of the support in Red River. The Canada Party was looking forward to this takeover of this Métis land. So they took up arms against the provisional government, and there was an individual there named Thomas Scott, who threatened to kill Riel. Well, that's going to be a problem because you can't go around threatening to kill anybody. That's against the law. So Thomas Scott, he gets charged, he gets sentenced, he's tried, and he's sentenced to death. Now, Anglophones and Francophones, they're going to have a different perspective on the death of Scott's death sentence. They're not going to be happy about it. And they're definitely going to make their voices heard. From an Anglophone perspective, This is what the English of Ontario were thinking. Thomas Scott, was an English Protestant. The British population of Ontario was now against the Métis provisional government because of what was being done to Thomas Scott. And they wanted revenge against the Métis leaders who tried him and sentenced him to death. The Francophones, on the other hand, they sided with the Métis. Francophones, if you remember, they're Catholic. Remember Louis Riel, he was studying to be a priest in Montreal. So the Francophones took the side of the Métis, being led by Louis Riel. And the Francophones saw the Métis as defenders of Francophone life, and they saw the Métis cause as not just a Métis cause, but an entire Francophone cause. And the conflict now that is taking place renews the long-standing tensions that existed since the beginning of the explorers, the French and the English, coming to North America. The tensions between the French and the English are now at its highest point, what seems like ever. All right, head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.